Another day and yet another unsurprising yet somehow still disappointing story about how the people behind The Witcher on Netflix are bleeding the franchise dry and running it into the ground. Before we get too deep into this, I want to provide some necessary context. The first season of The Witcher was released in December of 2019. It was one of the most watched shows across all the streaming platforms. It was a nice cash cow for Netflix, which frankly at the time needed the money, and had a massive 91% Rotten Tomato score amongst fans. Season 2 is released, viewership drops by a third, and the fan score goes from the 90s to the 60s. Then comes along Season 3, viewership is now down to half of what it once was, and it will never get anything even close to even that pathetic number ever again, and the fan score drops all the way down to the low teens. Fan favorite Henry Cavill has since left the show, and Season 4 is still at least a year and a half away, not that anybody cares. So what happened to The Witcher that it went from the next big fantasy IP that's going to have its own cinematic universe to where it stands now, sinking daily further and further into irrelevance and has no social currency to speak of? In a word, arrogance. Let me explain. I've made videos on any number of adaptations. Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon, The Witcher, The Wheel of Time, Rings of Power, you name it. No matter which show you're watching, you'll find one constant. The good adaptations always have a fundamental, palpable, underlying respect for the source material, and the bad ones don't. Now, I'm not talking about staying strictly pure to the script. Every reasonable adult knows you have to make some changes. The Godfather movie had changes. The Peter Jackson movies had changes. It's just inevitable. So the question becomes, do they both understand and respect the original story? Or are they just using it as a platform to push their own work or their own narratives? Which brings us full circle to the point of today's video. At a Comic-Con event, original Witcher author Andrzej Sapkowski, and yes, I'm 100% certain I mispronounced that name, was asked about the Netflix live-action adaptation of his work. After some initial kind words about how tremendous it was to visit the set, Mr. Sapkowski elaborated that he offered the powers that be behind the show his thoughts, and they had no interest in listening to him. Imagine that conversation. Hey guys, I created these characters out of my own imagination and built them up from nothing, and I have a few ideas on how we can best adapt them to the screen. Well, now, thanks, but no thanks. We know better. But I'll tell you what, the craft service table's right over there. Why don't you help yourself to a free bagel? Of course, I'm being a little facetious here, and when I say arrogance, I'm not trying to attack these people as individuals, moreover, the overriding mentality with which they bring to these projects. Also, in case you're wondering, this is not a one-off incident. We know from previous reports that not only was the original source material not held in high regard, in fact, it was routinely openly mocked by the writers of the show. When Henry Cavill himself tried to turn the show back into the right direction, he too was, for lack of a better word, ignored. Another example is Season 2. As fans consumed Season 2, they made it very clear and very public about how disappointed they were that there was so little of The Witcher in a show called The Witcher. That's kind of like making a He-Man show that doesn't actually have He-Man in it, and nobody would be that stupid. Eventually, the complaints about how little we saw of Geralt in Season 2 made its way to Twitter, where lead writer Lauren Hissrich essentially bragged about promoting the female characters at the expense of The Witcher himself. Miss Hissrich was in no way being obnoxious or even mean-spirited. She just had this underlying out-of-touch mentality that it was her job to promote other narratives instead of the stories from the original book. All this while the show was losing a third of its viewers and its Rotten Tomato score was plummeting. What may be worse is, over time, she made it very clear that those other characters were going to be the focus of the show moving forward. Thus, with his character being shoved to the background, as soon as he was contractually able, Henry Cavill decided to leave the show. Thus, the series is now in shambles, already bleeding more viewers than it can afford, and the franchise as a whole likely has no substantive future to look forward to. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments section below. Do you think the show actually has a future? If so, please explain why. If not, what do you think killed it? And as always, like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.